Welcome to Section 2 of Creative Collaboration, where we're going to discuss frameworks. The definition of creativity is pretty well established, and the systemic process for producing creative solutions to problems is also well established. There are many models, but they all share similar root components: problem identification, followed by a process of divergence, emergence, and then convergence. A definition of creativity is a non-formulaic solution that is both novel and appropriate to the problem. I'm going to run you through a couple creativity models just to show you how similar they are in the context of problem identification, divergence, emergence, and finally convergence. The Stanford Design School has structured creativity as a 5-step process: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. They go as follows. Empathize relates to gathering information that you're going to use for your problem. Once you have that, you begin to structure that information, hence define. So you're going from a divergent to a convergent process. But once you've structured that information, once you've defined it, then you move back up into a divergent process of ideating. That's the generation of multiple ideas to try and figure out how to solve that particular problem. Once you've moved up through that divergent process, you start to converge again on prototyping for that process, which is a form of validating the idea. Finally, you test it to see if it worked. If it did, you're done. If it doesn't, you go back through and you iterate through the process. Now, the design from IDEO seems to follow a very similar process with a different model. Empathy is built into their inspiration process, and the problem-finding part is part of the inspiration. The ideation here and the D schools define both provide the problem some structure. And again, we see divergence, convergence, divergence, convergence, right through finding the problem, working through the problem, finding a solution for the problem. Keith Sawyer is a well-known creativity researcher. In his recent book, Zigzag, he goes through these 8 steps. The first 3, ask, learn, and look, really follow a process of divergence. Ask refers to finding and formulating the problem. Learn, acquire knowledge relevant to the problem. And look, gather a broad range of potentially related information. His next 3 steps really relate to emergence. Play, take time off for incubation. Think, generate a large variety of ideas. Fuse, combine those ideas in unexpected ways. And his last 2, choose and make, are part of the convergent process. Choose, select the best ideas, applying relevant criteria, and make, externalize the idea using materials and representation. To express how long the creativity process has had some structure, I'm going to bring you back to the Componential Theory of Creativity framework by Teresa Amabile. She originally developed this model in the early 80s. The first step is problem or task identification, similar to empathize from the D school. The second is preparation, right? Building up and or reactivating store of relevant information. The third is response generation, so searching your memory and immediate environment to generate response possibilities. Fourth is response validation and communication, so you test your responses against the criteria you have set up. Finally, you have the outcome. And there's 3 ways in which you think about this outcome. 1, you've attained your goal. 2, there's no reasonable response. And 3, you've made some progress. Now, as you can see, if you attain your goal, you end the process. If you have no reasonable response, you end the process. But if you've made some progress, you return to steps 1, 2, 3, or 4, wherever you're at in kind of developing your next stage or iterating through the process. Now, there's a couple of things that she covers the other models don't. 1, the environment affects the way that you go through this process. 2, the individual components involved in the success of this process. There's task motivation, domain relevant skills, and creativity relevant processes. So the task motivation has to do with your attitudes towards the task, perceptions of your own motivation for undertaking the task, and a lot of these actually end up being intrinsically motivated, so how compelling a problem is, right? So the question you can ask, are you excited or compelled to act? Domain relevant skills have to do with the knowledge that you've acquired, both disciplinarily and life skills, right? So the question, do you have what it takes? Do you have the skill sets? Do you have the expertise that's necessary for solving the problem? Finally, creativity relevant processes. And so these are appropriate cognitive styles, implicit or explicit knowledge of heuristics for generating ideas, conducive working style. And so the questions you can ask for this, are you using your brain in the right way? Perhaps more accurately, are you using your brain the wrong way, but to your creative benefit? Amabile breaks these creativity skills down into a couple of different sets. First of all is set breaking. And there's perceptual, cognitive, and disciplinary set breaking. So perceptual has to do with functional fixedness. The way you could think about this is the traditional creativity tests, right? How many uses are there for a paperclip? Cognitive set breaking has to do with particular problem-solving strategies that you would use. And so the ability to break from the problem-solving strategies that you would normally use, usually associated with a discipline, help with creative process. Finally, there's disciplinary scripts. Disciplinary script breaking would have to do with a shift in perspectives and, in effect, interpretations, what we learned about in section 1. As we were discussing with perspectives and interpretations, we developed categories. One way to improve our ability to come up with creative ideas is to widen those categories. Another component that she finds critical is remembering accurately. Now this one's really interesting for creative collaboration because no one person has to remember everything. People in the group can remember different things and actually combine that work, right, or combine those ideas. Something that has been coined transactive memory. Finally, we have a couple of behavioral components here, right? So delaying consensus, which means that you don't try to come up with the solution right away. Suspending judgment, ideas that come in aren't judged and shut down right away, but they're allowed to sit so that you can actually think through that process and see how they might be useful. And creative perception, the ability to take two ideas that seem unrelated and find ways of blending them. These creativity skills play into different heuristics that we can use for generating novel ideas. So we have to have knowledge of heuristics for generating these novel responses. Many of these heuristics can be segmented into identifying extremes and altering perspectives. If we were to think of your ideas as a bell curve, most of your ideas are going to fall in the center. The challenge is, when you're stuck on particular ideas, you can think of those as your khaki pants ideas. They're pretty bland and you can't distinguish them from other ideas. So what you want to do, you want to be able to stretch an idea to make the question more broad or abstract, or you want to be able to squeeze the idea to make it more narrow and concrete. It's a way of pulling that idea apart a little bit to get a better understanding of where you're going. So if you think of moving towards one extreme or one outlier, you'd say, how do I concretize this idea? How do I put some rules around this idea and how do I bound it? You're not moving it all the way over there to pick that idea, but you're moving it all the way over there to stretch the idea and find out where you're headed. On the other end, you can abstract that idea, put fewer rules around it, stretch the idea some more, and see where that takes you. A fun exercise to do with an idea is to play world's worst. What's the world's worst job interview? World's worst ice cream flavor. World's worst pickup line. World's worst goodbye note. World's worst eulogy. So if you take these and you actually play them out in all their sensory detail, then you start to really get a sense of where extremes lie and how you want to pull your ideas back and forth. Another good practice is to switch perspectives. If you're an artist, how might a scientist answer the question? And if you want to be really specific, you can say, if you're a photographer, how might an ecologist answer that question? This helps you play both with framing the idea and asking different kinds of questions and coming up with different kinds of solutions. You can extend this too. You can stretch it in any way you want. How might a fourth grader answer a question? How might they ask a question? What's the first thing he or she might notice? It doesn't just have to be people. How might a dog explore the world? And you can stretch that further. How might a chihuahua explore the world differently than a pit bull? Another good practice is to use analogies. Kevin Dunbar breaks it into 3 components. So local analogies are often used when there's a specific and often technical problem. Scientists might attempt to borrow techniques from other similar studies hoping to resolve an issue, right? So there's direct pattern matching. Regional analogies make connections between different disciplines, making connections that were more difficult to see than the connections used in local analogies. And long-distance analogies can be used when explaining ideas. An example I've heard often for a long-term analogy is that wetlands are like the kidneys of an ecosystem. This type of analogy serves to be more instructional or educational, allowing people to understand how the concept fits. We've been discussing a lot of the creativity components, but I want to pivot a little bit here. What I want to do is provide further structure for thinking about creativity in a collaborative context. A great method I found is through the concept of game storming developed by the designers at X-Plane. As you'll notice, this is going to look similar to the other creativity models. After a challenge has been defined, we begin by generating several ideas. We take those ideas and recombine them to create new patterns of nested ideas and concepts. Those concepts are pruned, refined, and further curated to make the concept more succinct. So you can conceptualize this as playing a game. To To enter into a game is to enter another kind of space where the rules of ordinary life are temporarily suspended and replaced with the rules of the game. This holds true for any game you play. Basketball, Monopoly, chess, Scrabble. Games have conditions under which they are organized. As we go through this process, pick a game you enjoy playing and test how these conditions to the game space applies. So first, players must agree to abide by the rules of that space. When you enter a game, you all agree that you're going to play by those particular rules. Second, games are bounded. So they're bounded by time, space, they can be paused, and they can be terminated. There are rules of interactions, agreed upon norms that players abide by. Artifacts hold information about the game. They track progress, and they identify the current state. Finally, games are goal-oriented. You must be able to identify when the game is over. This requires that you have a target, right? What do you want to accomplish, and what does success look like in the game? So what you do is you begin with understanding what your target is. And then you identify your current state. What do we currently know? What don't we know? And what resources are available to us? Let's put some of these ideas to practice. I want you to try this in a couple of ways. One, you could take any one of these heuristics and use them by themselves. World's worst, switch perspectives, or fantastical explanations. A fantastical explanation fits two criteria. The stories should be false, but they should be plausible somehow. Two, you combine them. So let's say world's worst diaper change, but take that from the perspective of a 6-month-old. Or you could switch perspectives again to saying a 4th grader fantastical explanation of why the sky is blue. I'll let you choose how you want to play with these. That's it for this section. For our final section, we'll discuss methods and heuristics for collaborations as well as personal dispositions to making you a good creative collaborator.